flat roof, and they don't have any shading. And the question is there any, you know, aside from just having an installer evaluate the situation and look at the loads and propose something, are there any tax incentives or breaks that churches can get for the installation of solar?
Yeah, churches, of course, one of the difficulties you've got is that a lot of the incentives are tax-based. And if you're a situation like a church where you don't pay any taxes, then those incentives are not available to you. But what actually typically happens is churches or schools will work with an investor, a private investor, who will front all of the costs of installing the solar on their building, and then will you know, benefit from the taxes. And they can either do a lease, you know, a straight out lease to the church, where they say, here's how much money we're going to charge you each month for your electric. Or they can do what's referred to as a power purchase agreement, where they say, here is the amount per kilowatt hour that we're going to charge you, which is often preferred because, you know, then you're paying based on usage versus, you know, a flat fee. So,
okay.
So I would explore that before the church goes out and starts looking at putting in their own system, because that might actually benefit the church more, because they don't have to come up with any money to pay for the installation. And they get all of the benefits of cheaper electricity. You know, they can all look at the solar panels and go, aren't we being green? You know, that kind of thing. But you don't have to put that money up front. But besides that, really not a lot, because they're all tax-based, you know, the incentives.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for recording this. I will share your comments with this high school classmate.
Okay. Yeah, and as I mentioned, I've been recording these sessions, and then we'll go ahead and post them on YouTube, and I try and put out some links there. So so watch your language, right? It's recorded for posterity. Well, we had touched on, as we got started, a little bit about Texas, because that's in the news at the moment. So I thought I'd do a little bit of research just to get things rolling. I wanted to look at, you know, we touched last week a little bit about how some of the Republican politicians immediately jumped out and started blaming, you know, windmills, which drives me crazy, because windmills grind grain. They don't grind, you know, they're wind turbines, first off. But secondly, it was a non-issue. There were some other, the primary cause of the power losses were water freezing, and these are coolants used in natural gas and coal power plants and nuclear power plants. So it was really just that the state is not weatherized. You know, their pipes freeze, everything freezes. Well, that's understandable when you only get freezing temperatures once every few years. But to then jump up and down and blame wind turbines, I mean, that's just political posturing. So one of the things that you may have been hearing a lot about is ERCOT, ERCOT, which is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. And they make a big deal about Texas has its own power grid. Well, it's had that power grid for quite a long time. It's just that the way the system is organized, Texas, because it's such a large venue, has had its own power grid. It's not quite all of the state of Texas, but most of it. So it's not like, you know, when you go in and you see all the don't mess with Texas stuff. It just is the way that they organize. So I wouldn't read a lot into that. But they are an aggressively deregulated marketplace, which can be good, can be bad in those situations. But for anybody who felt like this freeze was not predicted, then if you go back 2011, there was a freeze, and an energy company, Luminet, had massive power outages. They were investigated by the Texas Public Utility Commission, fined $750,000, which sounds like a lot to you or me, but it's really like us getting fined $10. And told, you didn't design this for cold weather, you need to clean up your act. All right, 2014, same thing happened. There was an investigation, recommended they didn't design for cold weather, nothing happened. 2017, a federal investigation of Texas's infrastructure, not designed for cold weather, recommended upgrading, nothing happened. So you're asking, Bill, are they going to change this time? Chances are, you know, every 3 years they have a cold snap, and every 3 years somebody says, you know, you really ought to prepare for this cold snap, and every 3 years they do nothing because there is no incentive for them to do anything. And one of the things that you're seeing reports of here recently is people getting hit with huge electric bills. So I was trying to figure out why that was happening. And we hear about demand charges and things of that nature for electricity. If you've got a baseline supply, often electrical from the grid costs about 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour. You know, that's kind of the average generating cost. And then they turn around and sell it for 7 or 8 cents a kilowatt hour. They make a profit, and then they have their distribution charges, their transmission charges, their access charges. So you end up somewhere around 12, 13, 14, 18 cents a kilowatt hour, depending on where you are. When you do have a disruption of supply, then you either have to bring online power plants that are more expensive to run, which kicks up the cost, or you have to buy it on the open market from somebody else. Texas had to buy it on the open market from somebody else, and we're paying as much as $9,000 per megawatt hour for this power. That's a lot. That's basically what, $90 a kilowatt hour? And you're turning around, in most cases, you're going to sell it for 12 cents. So if a utility bill was, if they were being billed $90 and selling it for a fixed fee of 12 cents, they're hating life, you know, they're suffering. That's why companies will incentivize to protect themselves from those situations. But in Texas, it's a fairly common billing practice where they simply charge whatever the going rate is for generation to their customers. So if they're paying $35, they just charge $35 per megawatt hour and put a little markup on it. If they're paying $9,000, they charge $9,000 and put a little markup. So there's zero incentive for them to conserve because they're going to charge whatever it costs them. Doesn't matter. And so there was an NPR story where they talked about a couple in Dallas, a family. Their January electric bill was $257, fairly normal for a suburban home. So far in February, their electric bill is $10,180. Okay, so that's what, half the month, 2/3 of the month? So they're going to be facing at least a $10,000, maybe a $15,000 electric bill, only because of the way the billing system is structured. So there is movement now in the federal government to come in and bail those people out, which, yeah, that helps, but guess who gets the money? The electric companies who have been disincentivized to do anything correctly. So basically, it's another bailout for electric companies, which is frustrating. You know, you don't want to see the people have to pay 15 grand for their electric bill, but you also don't want to see the electric company rewarded for bad behavior and bad decision making. So, and some of the politicians involved in all of this nonsense, I saw a quote from Rick Perry, you know, everybody loves Rick Perry. And he was saying how the people in Texas would be happy to go days, weeks without electricity if it meant the federal government would stay off their back. Well, yeah. So I just found it interesting that Rick Perry, as soon as he left his job as energy secretary, was hired to be on the board of directors of Energy Transfer Company in Texas. And he is on the board and he's paid over $250,000 to attend one meeting a year. So this is the revolving door of our regulators. Clearly, there's no incentive for these guys to come down harshly on these corporations who are then going to reward them with these cushy positions as soon as they're able to. So anyway.
I think you're right, Jay, but remember Selectra had people on the board too, or whatever that.
Yeah.
There's
there's for sure corruption there all around. And that's frustrating. But it's
Agreed.
Especially frustrating when we hear the free market argument, except when those companies lose money. And, it's that constant privatized profits and socialized losses.
Agreed. They shouldn't bail them out, and they shouldn't bail the states out who gave the pensions in exchange for votes or political favors. None of them should be bailed out. You're exactly right.
That's right. And that's why for long periods of time, I've always argued in favor of getting rid of all energy subsidies. Get rid of all of the incentives, get rid of the federal tax credit for solar, get rid of all of the bailouts for fossil fuels, get rid of the nuclear subsidies, because when left on their own, renewable energy wins,
Well,
so,
not for the base load though, would it, Jay? I mean, you still need a base load that can be, of whatever you're gonna call it, coal, the gas is you can turn it up and turn it down really easily, and renewables are really good in the middle, but don't you still need a base load of, reliable, I'll call it coal because I live in Kentucky. I like it coal.
Yeah, I would say that yes, at least currently, base load, there is a role for fossil fuels, but those fossil fuel programs, just as renewable energy programs, should be able to compete without the intervention of subsidy.
Agreed.
If coal is the cheapest option, I may argue that it's polluting and the like, and that it's bad, but it may be the most economical and perhaps the most realistic option given the constraints that society faces at the moment. But that will change, but it will not change if the industry is subsidized beyond its normal life expectancy.
I think you're right, but just people need to be careful sometimes, not you, Jay, but I'm just saying a lot of people I see that talk about subsidies to the oil companies or to the energy companies, and all they're talking about is the same standard provisions that apply to every industrial company in the country as well as every service company in the country. Like the accelerated depreciation, that's just standard.
Right. But there are also specific, and I do have some information here about, oh no, that's for a different thing, but the nuclear industry, widely subsidized, and it is not economically viable. So that's an example, but there are also leases on public lands for oil and gas exploration that are well below market value. And you can really take it to the absurd when you start talking about the investment in infrastructure for transmission lines, for highway systems, the military to protect overseas oil interests, and a lot of these are going to be historic and a lot of them are modern day. Where do you draw the line? I mean, so you just say, it's as Mark Twain always said, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. So you can make the statistics say whatever you wish them to say. But realistically, in my ideal world where I control everything, I would get rid of all of them. I'd get rid of all the subsidies, and the only things that would be subsidized are those things I personally like. So, yeah, Bob?
Jay, So I don't understand how this works. If you get rid of all of the subsidies, where does the payola come from then?
Oh, there's always plenty of room for payola.
Yeah, they're ingenious. People will figure that out. That's the last thing to worry about. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. We will always find a way to facilitate corruption. So, all right. So, anybody have any questions on Texas, other than why someone would live there, right, Bill? I'm sure there's lots to love about Texas.
They have a great solar company down there, Solar.
Solar, yeah, yeah. Well, Texas has actually been one of the more aggressive renewable energy states. And I think it's a good example of the fact that the economics are there. And when the economics are there, the industry will win out. You know, government only plays around the edges with all of this stuff. You know, we can move forward progress by a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years at most. We can retard progress by a couple of years through government action. But the marketplace will win out eventually. And so long term, I think all of this is very positive. And
I tell the story, Houston invested in a solar farm 500 miles west, I say 7 years ago, and the conventional wisdom then was close proximity to a high voltage transmission line, cheap land, and good insulation. Well, lately they're building all sorts of solar farms in the Houston area. So, and the land is clearly not as cheap as it is in West Texas.
yeah,
So that's a very good sign. You know, the economics are there. You know, and not only that, there's the, you know, you can put in a gas-fired turbine, but compliance issues. We're in what's called a non-attainment area. That is, the permitting process for gas is somewhat protracted because of the pollution, and that's a good thing too.
Yeah, I was just doing some research on nuclear, and one of the things I found which was interesting is to build a brand new nuclear reactor will cost in the neighborhood of $9 billion for a 1,000 megawatt generating capacity. And a similar solar array will cost about $1 billion. So there's a 9-to-1 ratio there just simply for the initial construction cost. And of course, one of the downsides with nuclear is, you know, well, nuclear disasters are a bit troublesome, but they're infrequent, but they're catastrophic when they do occur. But the other thing is to decommission a nuclear power plant takes decades. I mean, the government requires that it be done in no more than 60 years to decommission a power plant. So, and out of all the nuclear power,
they don't have any place to put the waste. They can't. They have no place to put the waste. They keep putting that off. So
yeah,
it's all sitting around the plant.
One of their processes is to entomb it, like they did at Chernobyl. Just come in and cover everything in concrete and entomb it. But it's difficult and it's expensive. So you know, you're talking about at least $400 million to decommission a nuclear power plant, and 40 to 60 years. So out of all of the nuclear power plants constructed in the United States, only 10 have been successfully decommissioned. There are only 96, I think, 96 reactors, 58 different sites, but 96 reactors operating in the US with an average age of 39 years and an initial life expectancy of 40 years. That's how long they're commissioned for. So 88 of the 96 are over that 40-year life expectancy. So that's very problematic. And for those of us up here in Ohio, the Davis-Besse power plant is of particular concern, especially if you happen to be up around Toledo. One of the worst power plants in the country. It's been shut down, but not forgotten. And so it was part of the whole scandal with Senate Bill 6, where they decided to charge Ohio electric ratepayers $150 million a year to subsidize the bankrupt and shut down nuclear power plant for First Energy. And the only reason they did that is because they gave the state legislature $60 million. So it was definitely a pay to play. And so anyway, that's enough on the corruption front.
Dave, you looked at all the new design, those small nuclear plants they're talking about?
Yeah, I looked at some of those things. I don't hold a lot of hope. I mean, now you're just making them smaller and more widely dispersed. You know, anything that man can engineer, the people operating it can screw it up. You know, all of the nuclear accidents have been a combination of human error and tiny little flaws in the design, which probably would have been okay, except somebody did something stupid. You know, they decided that what they were seeing wasn't what they were seeing, so they turned the valve the opposite direction, you know, and made it worse. So yeah, there are a lot of Homer Simpsons working in nuclear power plants, you know, and it's not just nuclear. I mean, people screw up. That people just screw up, and you know, if it's a solar array, the result is not dramatic usually. But if it's a nuclear power plant, yeah, you know, it can be problematic. So I guess I would err, given the economics, that nuclear is not economic, given the downside risk, I would say that nuclear as an industry is dead. Now it's just going to take 40 years for it to quit kicking. You know, it's nobody's really building any new ones. There are a few being built in some of the countries like Russia, China, United Arab Emirates, but those are few and far between. You know,
Are the Indians still building their thorium plants?
yeah, they're still building some. You know, they're usually in those environments, but they're highly subsidized governmental projects. So it's just not a viable alternative. And it's been let's think, the major nuclear disasters, 70, when was 3 Mile Island?
79, early 80s?
Yeah, I think it was 79. And then 86 was Chernobyl. Then 2011 was Fukushima. So those have been the main three. So every 10, 15 years, I would say we're probably due for another one. Davis-Besse would be very problematic, being that it's right there in the Great Lakes. You know, if you had a nuclear energy spill, radiation spill into the largest freshwater system in the world, I would think that would be problematic. So, I mean, the Fukushima thing raised radiation levels throughout the Pacific Ocean. So, you know, that's a bit bigger than Lake Erie, at least last time I checked. All right. Did anybody, I know, Bill, you had raised the issue of safety. You wanted to talk about safety. What specifically were you looking for?
Well, I've done a couple of ground mounts off-grid systems, and you know, electrical safety is a big deal. I would hate for anybody to be hurt, shocked, or worse. And I just wanted to get some comments from you or anyone else regarding the electrical safety thing. You know, typically my systems are 24 volts with a charge controller and an inverter to make 110 volts, and appropriate fusing everywhere. You know, I did have one system where they put in a 1500 watt skillet to cook something, and it popped the fuse because it exceeded the capacity of the inverter. But I just wanted to hear your take on that. I would like to say, just for safety considerations.
Yeah, well, one of the things we touch on in class is there's no such thing as safe electricity. you know, everything about electricity is dangerous. Just because you're dealing with a 12 volt or 24 volt system does not mean that it is safe. You know, it can kill you dead or dead, just like, you know, 600 volts or whatever. In fact, higher voltage with lower amperage is much safer than, you know, a similar amount of energy transferred at a lower voltage, but at a much higher amperage. So they like to say that it's the amps that'll kill you. People love to say that. Not exactly true. It's a combination of the two. You know, you've got to have a certain amount of voltage to penetrate the skin, but it really is the amps that are going to do most of the damage. So you have to worry about that. And with battery systems, those amps can discharge all at once. You know, so you can get a massive discharge from a system that you wouldn't think would have that much power. So batteries within a standalone system are probably going to be your biggest danger point. Batteries can leak, lead acid batteries can leak hydrogen gas. In and of itself, that's not usually a big problem unless it becomes concentrated, and then it becomes explosive. Lithium-ion batteries have been known to be explosive, but usually only when physically damaged. Most of the battery injuries come from improper lifting or dropping it on your foot, you know, because batteries are heavy. And that doesn't sound like it's a big deal, but if you've hurt your back, it's a big deal. So I did have one guy, a student in class, he actually had his inverter fall off the wall onto his batteries. You know, it just wasn't mounted properly, which caused, you know, not only damage to the batteries and lead acid leaking all over the place, but you know, busted up his inverter. But had he been there, you know, when it fell, he could have really hurt himself. So those are issues. It's important to disconnect all power sources. Just be aware of that. To assume that even after you've disconnected them, that they're still live, because that happens. I like to tell the story. If you've been in class, sometimes I'll tell the one where I was working and I was working with a guy who was cutting. We were removing a stove from a building, and it was hardwired into the wall, a 240 outlet. And so he told me to go and turn off the main, which I went out and I turned off the main and I yelled, "Yeah, Robin, it's off." And then all of a sudden I hear a scream, and I came in and he's lying on the ground and his knife looked like a little sickle because he had cut into it and it had blown him across the room. And his thing is like, "I told you to turn it off." And, you know, I did. But there were two power panels. We didn't know that in this little building, there were two different power panels. And I turned off one, but not the right one. So you just always assume that there's power there, even if you've turned it off. You know, test it and then double check it. Some of the other dangers, of course, arc flashes. Arc flashes can cause blindness. That's an issue. Also, I've heard a lot of where arc, you know, something might arc when you're working up on a roof and you just sort of jerk back reflexively and fall off the roof. You know, that could be a problem. So it wasn't necessarily the electricity that got you. It was just the sudden stupid movement.
Yeah.
Tying off, speaking of fall hazard, that's another issue. You know, so tying off. If you guys, how many of you guys here have worked on roofs, installing panels on a roof? Just raise your hand if you have. Yeah. Yeah. And how many of you guys properly wore your harness and lanyard at all times while you were working on the roof?
It was less than a 20-degree roof.
Yeah, that doesn't matter. It wasn't more than 6 feet off the ground.
I guess in some parts it might have been.
Yeah. And the reality is, oftentimes you'll find it feels more dangerous to be tripping over the rope and getting that rope caught on rails and other people. So almost every job I've ever worked on, we've ended up, we start off with good intentions, but pretty much everybody disconnects by the time the job's over, just because you're tripping all over everybody. And once you've got a couple of rails up, you've got some pretty good purchase. You're already using that as your foot support, so it just doesn't feel as dangerous. So
I will say, Jay, when they put them on my own house, I wouldn't get up on the roof because it was more than a 45-degree angle, but they did wear their harness.
Yeah, well, more than a 45-degree angle, I think that would be, even if you've got the rails, you don't want to put all your weight on the rails to hold yourself in place. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, let me see. Okay. Circuit breakers, fuses. Are circuit breakers in a solar system, do they have to have a DC rating, or could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, if it's in a DC circuit, they must be rated for DC current. And that's very important. And you also want to make sure that your circuit breaker is at least equal to or less than the amperage rating of the wire that is connected to.
Right.
Otherwise, it's doing nothing. Then the wire will simply, all a breaker is, all a fuse is a weak spot in the circuit designed to fail first. And so it's got to be the weak spot in the circuit. But there is definitely DC rated breakers. There are AC rated breakers. They have to be sized appropriately and selected appropriately. There's also backfed breakers, where power going either direction will trip the breaker. And that's important with a solar array, because you're not only sending power to the grid, but you're bringing power from the grid. So if you don't have a backfed breaker, you might find that it pops or doesn't pop, based on the direction of the current flow. There are also ground fault interruption breakers, which you can use. Normally those have those little pigtail wires associated with them. So if you look in your circuit breaker box, and those are designed to pop if it senses a ground fault, which is another safety issue. Not necessarily required in many situations, but sometimes they are. We've seen those GFI outlets, that you see around water, on kitchen sinks or bathrooms or whatever. But you could hook an entire circuit to a ground fault interruption breaker and protect everyone and not have to have those GFI breaker or outlets at those locations, because they'd sense the same thing. What else about breakers? Make sure that, I don't know, this is old stuff, but the old fuses that you could stick a copper penny in behind them, that was just an old thing we used to run into. And if if the fuse kept popping, my grandpa would stick a penny in there so that it would stop popping. Well, now you don't have a breaker. It was popping for a reason.
I didn't know that trick before you had brought it up.
Yeah, now you do. So when your house burns down, I'll be getting a letter from your lawyer, right? So, yeah, those are issues. Usually you don't run into fuses very much anymore. Sometimes with the battery systems you do, but for the most part, you're going to run into breakers. A lot of the disconnects are fused. That's not a bad idea. Some of your AC disconnects and even your DC disconnects, they'll have fuses in them. That will prevent any overages from going past that disconnect point. But good idea to have breakers and fuses pretty much everywhere, and disconnects at every power source. Anything else, Bill?
No.
Nope. Anybody else have any issues on safety concerns? Other than, like in any job that you're doing, any construction job. I mean, electrical is highly, highly dangerous, and electricity does weird stuff, so sometimes it's hard to to figure out what's going on. And in fact, I was just looking at some of the requirements with electrical licensing, and it's surprising how much education is required to be an electrician. And we kind of jump into this in solar thinking, well, we can go out there and install a solar PV system with little or no training. And while that's likely that we can do it, we will not have been faced with every situation that might occur. In a traditional electrical situation, there's going to be a situation where the person goes through a 4-year apprenticeship program, with 8,000 hours working under a journeyman. Then they'll go through a journeyman's licensing process, which might be another 6,000 hours, another 3 years. And then they become a master electrician. So really, you've got 7 years of experience plus education before you're considered to be competent to pull an electrical permit on a commercial basis. So that's really quite a lot of training. Another thing I thought I'd bring up, I got a copy. If you guys aren't members, this is the magazine from ACES, the American Society. What is it? The American Solar Energy Society. It is, and worthwhile joining. It's only, I think, like $35 a year, but they send us out. And this article was talking about the Biden administration's goals for clean energy. There was an article here. So I thought I'd hit the highlights if we had time. It's looking at allocating $400 billion over the next 10 years for investment in training and research. That could be a governmental black hole, who knows? But they're going to basically workforce development. That's what they're looking at there. One thing which I think is a good initiative, and I guess just since I'll agree with Don on some of these things and disagree with him on others, but I always like to say that when it comes to politics, especially government, I am liberal by nature because I think government has a positive role to play in our society, but I'm conservative because I've never actually seen it happen. So I like the theory of government more than the reality. So we'll see how that works. But anyway, they want to address climate and energy issues in every single infrastructure investment decision. So I think that's a good thing. To every time you're going to invest in something, let's say, how does this affect the climate? How does this affect our energy infrastructure? So that's a nice thing. I mean, that's a good sanity check. Reduce the carbon footprint of all buildings within the federal government by 50% by 2035. So that's a good thing, meaning weatherization, things of that nature. 100% clean energy by 2035. That's another goal. Don, you had a comment?
Yeah, those both sound very expensive, Jay.
They could be, although weatherization and energy, that always pays for itself. I mean, study after study shows, you save like $4 for every dollar you invest. So those are that's the low hanging fruit,
It's common sense if I agree with you 100%. If it's weatherizing, putting up, something to make it more efficient or make it more better insulation. Yeah. I somehow think that's not on top of their list, but yes, all that stuff I agree with you.
Yeah.
I have to say that when there was Illinois Black program running that as an installer, I had to tell them exactly how much they're going to be using so they can cut their check for 15 years.
Yeah.
And so if we and my customer puts up money, a bond on that thing, so that if at any time it goes over that, they just take it out of there. Mm-hmm. So what I do is I'm conservative on my estimates so that I make sure I'm under, but then at the end I go into my customers and we do a total energy audit and we bring down his load so that we just put a stamp on that we're going to meet what the Illinois block program, we reported to them how much the usage was going to be.
Yeah. One of my concerns, of course, has been that as energy costs get cheaper and cheaper, then conservation tends to go out the window, you know, so it's good to conserve. That's always good, but people being people, you know, if it's cheap, they won't be as focused on it. And that's really going to be solar's fault, because solar is driving down the cost of energy. So as we approach zero on the cost of energy, we're going to see lack of conservation. That's just normal. The acceleration of the electrical vehicle deployment, they're looking at trying to push for 500,000 public charging stations by 2030. So that'll be good. Hopefully that'll be a private company initiative. Heard an interesting podcast from a woman who's the CEO of one of the large charging station companies, and they're targeting grocery stores, shopping centers, you know, for putting up in their EV charging units. I think we'll start to see a lot of partnerships with vehicle producers. So if you buy an EV from GM, you'll get free charging, you know, within the network per se, you know, out there. So we'll see that happen. That's going to happen as people get EVs. You know, that's just kind of, but they're concerned with the chicken and egg thing. You're not going to buy an EV until there are charging stations, and the corporations are not going to install charging stations until there are enough EVs. So how do you promote that?
Jay, have they been any? I know a couple of years ago there was an Israeli company that was talking about having a replaceable battery as opposed to charging stations. You drive in, it pops out your battery, it pops a new one in, and it's like you know, like your propane. It's like your propane tank. You put a deposit down for one, and then keep doing that.
Yeah.
And it was a quicker, more efficient way, it seemed like. Is there any more impetus for that?
I heard about that when it was first out, and there was a lot of buzz on it, but I haven't heard anything since. So my guess is that's an idea that kind of fizzled, because that would require all of the EVs to be fairly standardized in how their batteries, you know, pop in and pop out. With the fast charging stations, you're really only talking about 20 minutes to charge your system. So by the time you would remove a battery, install a new battery, you're probably looking at 20 minutes anyway. So I think one of the things with EV charging is the first 90% of your battery's capacity can be charged relatively quickly. It's the last 10% that takes all the time. So what you may find is these fast charging stations will get you up to 90%, you know, within 10 minutes or so. And then, you know, don't worry about the last 10% until you get home. So, and if you've got a range of 200 miles or 300 miles, 90% is fine. So, but,
makes sense.
You know, until it gets as convenient as filling up your tank with gasoline, it's going to be problematic. You know, but if there's a situation like at a grocery store or whatever, yeah, 10, 20 minutes, that's fairly normal. But for instance, I've used the public EV charging station down in Marietta, and it takes a full 2 hours for it to charge up to give me 35 miles of range. Well, that's not very helpful, you know.
That's not at level 2 charging, is it?
Yeah, that's a level 2 charge, not a level 3, but it's a level 2, 240 volt.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. The level 3 are usually going to be like 600 volt or 1200 volt DC charging. So they just blast that power in, and there you're talking about 20 minutes or so. But
Well,
that's
it depends on the kWh of the battery, and I know I have a Nissan Leaf, and yeah, 20 minutes, but that's only 60 or 70 miles, and that's my range, say 70 miles. So, yeah, but all the new cars are well in excess of 100-mile range, if not 200. You know, so the charge time on these vehicles is commensurately longer, I would say.
Yeah. And mine is a Prius Prime, so it's maximum. It's a hybrid, so it only has a 35-mile electric range, and then the motor kicks in. Although I have found, because of the large battery, it has regenerative braking. So the actual miles per gallon on the vehicle, even with no electric charge, ends up being about 70 miles to the gallon. So that's pretty, with the blended between the electric and the hybrid, we get on average, since we bought it, 100 miles to the gallon. So that's nice. I mean, but we're in such a rural area that the only charging station is wherever we can plug into a wall outlet. There's really are no electric vehicle charging stations. And one of the other issues we're running into is that the difference is, it's almost like the Mac versus the IBM thing. The Teslas have a different plug outlet than the other charging. So if you go to, say, like for instance, Sheetz, they have a bunch of Tesla charging stations, but they'll only charge your Tesla. So you can't charge another EV. So that's another protocol that's got to get worked out as we move forward, to get basically a USB for your car, a universal port, so that we can get this stuff all ironed out. But it's going to happen. I mean, everything's moving to electric. And once again, it's because it is economical. Electric vehicles, I think I just read an article that the cost of building an electric vehicle just met the cost of building an internal combustion engine vehicle. So the production costs are similar. The maintenance costs are much less for an electric vehicle, but I don't know if that includes battery replacement or not, because battery replacement is a substantial cost. And that's going to be in what, 7, 8, 10 years? If every 8 or 9 years you had to pull the engine on your car and replace it, that would be a significant maintenance cost. So.
And what's the dollars per mile comparison? Are they comparable?
No, you mean the cost of fuel or the cost of driving?
I would say the cost of fuel, electricity is plugging into your wall, like you said, your outlet. What's the dollars per mile for transportation? I know that some of the costs I've seen, let me think. I figured it out one time. It's my battery is a 7 kilowatt hour battery, and it gets 35 miles. So if you're talking about 12 cents a kilowatt hour, then you're talking in the neighborhood of about what, $1 to get 35 miles. Okay.
So, and 35 miles, that would be comparable to a gallon of gasoline typically. So yeah, about $1 a gallon for the cost of electricity. I think that's a fair number. They'll come up with others that are absurd, but I think in my experience, that seems reasonable. So just on the cost, but the cost of maintenance is substantially less.
Is that just using the electric, or is that the electric and the hybrid when you're doing it that way?
No, that's just the electric to get 35 miles just from electricity. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the Leaf. Yeah. Well, Bill, you've got different experience.
We're talking about cars. I'm a member of the Houston Electric Car Club, HEAA.org. And we zoom in speakers from all the new electric car and truck manufacturers. And if anybody wants to Zoom participate in the meeting, I believe it's the first Thursday of each month. We have very interesting speakers. The last one was from the three-wheel car called Aptera, that has a 1,000-mile range and 40-mile solar on a good day. But they're extremely interesting, the meetings and all the new engineering that's being done going forward.
How long have you owned an electric car?
Oh, you a long time.
And
the 90s.
What's been your
90s,
experience in maintenance costs?
Well, I purchased a Nissan Leaf 4 or 5 years ago, and the only problem I had is the heat has gone out. And unfortunately, that series of IGBTs cost $2,000 to replace. So I have a heated seat. But in terms of maintenance, no, I haven't had any other expenses in that area. You asked me how long I've been doing an electric car. I bought maybe 15 years ago. The deal was California had a law that all car companies would start selling electric cars. And I bought, I hate to tell you, more than 2 Selectria cars. They were manufactured, I believe, in Boston. I currently have 2 electric trucks, which were engineered, and maybe sometime I can take my phone outside and lift up the bed. And they did a wonderful job. They've got 2 3-phase AC motors that are belted. They turn the rear axle around 180 degrees to where the drive shaft points backwards, and then the 2 motors are belted to a big pulley. And when those motors are going 7,000 RPM, I'm going 70 miles an hour. And they're wonderful cars, except they had lead acid battery packs.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and I'd be more than happy to show you at some future meeting on that. But
well,
anyway,
we'll let it warm up before we do that, so you're not outside freezing to death.
Sure.
Can you send
Yeah.
around the link for that you mentioned for the meetings? Your first Thursday meetings?
Oh, I'm sorry. What was the question?
Can you send around the link, or email us what the link is?
Yeah, I guess I can do a chat, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, with the chat, I think Bruce had asked about vanadium batteries. I'm not familiar. I know there are a bunch of different lithium configurations. Is that one of them, lithium vanadium, or is it a vanadium thing that's a completely different battery?
Yeah, AJ, it's Bruce. No, I just read something recently on the web about it's a brand new technology. It's supposed to be better than lithium. I think they're looking for investors, and I just kind of said, okay, this is all the positive here.
Yeah. I've heard of liquid metal batteries, and vanadium I know is a kind of metal. So it might be that. I mean, there's so many different kinds of emerging battery technologies that, I think it's safe to say lithium will be a bridge technology to whatever is next. That bridge may last us 10 years, but it's definitely going to move on to something new and exciting. And we used to just talk about lithium batteries, but now in the literature, they start differentiating into the dozen or so different kinds or different flavors of lithium batteries. And of course, lithium is just a salt. It's a kind of a salt. So you've got some of the manganese salts and the saltwater batteries. So we'll see. That's an exciting technology. Battery technology, that's the next horizon. That's the next big thing. And that's going to be a game changer for all of us. We're living in interesting times.
Once it gets here.
I put the link to the meeting in the chat area, heaa.org. Also, I would just like to ask, Jay, I wanted to refer some other people to this meetup and just send an email to you with their email address.
Yeah, if you do that, I'll add them into the list. Or feel free to invite whomever you want to invite, because the idea is you've been through 1 or 2 or 3 of these, you'll just see it's just sort of free ranging. I try and come up with a couple of topics in case nobody's got anything on their mind, but mostly just see what's happening. So, all right, anybody else have anything before we call it a day?
Bill, I was going to say that link you sent, it's got the old meetings recorded too.
Okay, yeah. Great. So you can chime into those.
All right.
If you have an engineering technical background, some of the ideas being discussed are in some sense radical.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll see you guys all next Tuesday. Take care. Stay warm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.